In the early months of 1943, the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had reached a brutal and uncertain equilibrium. German divisions, battered and thin from months of unrelenting combat, were retreating westward through the frozen steppes. The crackle of rifle fire and the low rumble of artillery echoed over the snow crust, but on this day, the front had fallen into a tense silence. Smoke drifted from the ruins of a burned-out village. A column of Wehrmacht infantry trudged past the wreckage, exhausted and half-frozen, their eyes hollow from fatigue. Yet among the twisted metal and shattered equipment, something caught the attention of a young German officer. Parked awkwardly in a ditch, its olive drab paint dusted with frost and grime, stood a small, boxy vehicle unlike anything most of them had seen before. It was squat, utilitarian, and unfamiliar, a foreign shape amid the detritus of war. One of the soldiers muttered, "Ein amerikanischer Jeep." The word itself sounded strange. The officer, Oberleutnant Karl Fischer of the 4th Panzer Grenadier Division, motioned his men forward cautiously. "Hold fire, check for mines. This might be important." The soldiers approached, rifles raised, eyes wary. The vehicle was abandoned, its engine still faintly warm. Bullet holes pocked the hood, and one tire was shredded, but it was otherwise intact. Inside lay a torn map marked with Allied insignia, a field ration tin labeled in English, and a steel helmet with the faded emblem of the United States Army. Fisher ran his gloved hand over the steering wheel, feeling the coarse texture of the material. "So this is what the Americans drive," he murmured, half to himself. What they had stumbled upon was a Willys MB Jeep, one of the most iconic vehicles of World War II, though at that time, few in the German army knew its name. The moment of discovery would become more than a curiosity. It was the meeting of two engineering philosophies born from two very different societies. The Germans, known for precision and complexity, built machines like the Kübelwagen, refined, calculated, and efficient on paper. The Americans, on the other hand, produced something rugged, simple, and astonishingly effective in the field. The Jeep's squat stance and sturdy design fascinated Fisher. He ordered his men to pull it from the ditch. With ropes and brute effort, the squad heaved it onto the road. A corporal inspected the engine bay and exclaimed in surprise, "Herr Oberleutnant, it is simple, incredibly simple." Indeed, the layout was almost minimalist compared to German vehicles. No delicate fittings, no excessive ornamentation. Every bolt and lever seemed placed with purpose. The Germans were used to machines that demanded care and precision. This one seemed built to survive abuse. As they examined the Jeep, curiosity spread among the troops. They were mechanics, drivers, soldiers, men who had spent years maintaining panzer tanks and transport trucks that broke down in mud and ice. The American machine before them looked crude, even primitive, yet there was an elegance to its simplicity. One private turned the crankshaft experimentally and laughed. "It runs, Herr Oberleutnant. The enemy leaves us a working car." Fisher ordered it taken to their field workshop. The soldiers towed it behind a half-drag, shielding it under a camouflage tarp. That night, by the dim glow of lanterns, they gathered around the captured vehicle like archaeologists examining an artifact from another world. The sergeant mechanic, a wiry man named Vogel, removed the engine cover and peered inside. "This is extraordinary," he said softly. "It is as if it were designed to be repaired by anyone, even a farmer." The narrator's voice would carry the weight of revelation. In that frozen corner of the Eastern Front, a captured Jeep told a story far greater than any single battle. It spoke of industrial power, design philosophy, and the fate of nations. As dawn broke, the men experimented with the Jeep. They filled its tank with captured fuel and pushed it down a dirt road. The little engine coughed, then roared to life with a deep, even rumble. Fisher climbed in and took the wheel. The suspension bounced over the frozen ruts, yet the Jeep never faltered. Its four-wheel drive gripped the terrain with surprising agility. The soldiers followed on foot, laughing and cheering as the foreign machine surged ahead through mud and snow. In that moment, it became clear that this was not just another vehicle. It was a tool of mobility, a machine built for adaptability. The Americans, it seemed, had found a way to merge function and efficiency in a form that could be mass-produced without losing reliability. Fisher halted the Jeep beside a line of burned-out Kubel wagons. The comparison was stark. The German light utility car, designed by Ferdinand Porsche and beloved by officers for its elegance, was sleek but temperamental. It handled well on dry roads but struggled in deep mud or snow. The Jeep, by contrast, seemed to thrive in the worst conditions. Fisher looked between them and muttered, "Our car was built to perform perfectly. Theirs was built to perform anywhere." That quiet remark captured the essence of the moment, a dawning recognition that the war of machines was not simply a contest of power, but of philosophy. The German military, for all its engineering brilliance, had chained itself to complexity. The Americans, driven by practicality and mass production, had embraced simplicity as a weapon. News of the captured vehicle spread through the company. Higher command sent word the Jeep was to be studied. Mechanics took notes, sketched diagrams, and documented every part. The Wehrmacht was fascinated by its adaptability. Even German officers who had mocked Allied machinery as crude began to wonder. If a single vehicle could outperform theirs in field conditions, what did that say about the enemy's industrial strength? The Eastern Front had always been a crucible for technology. Engines froze, oil congealed, and tires disintegrated under the brutal conditions. German logistics strained to maintain their sophisticated machines. But the Jeep, this small American interloper, seemed impervious to the elements. Soldiers joked that it must have been built by blacksmiths, not engineers. Yet beneath that humor was a growing respect and unease. As snow began to fall again, Fisher stood beside the idling Jeep, its engine humming steadily. "Perhaps," he said to Vogel, "this is how they will win. Not through brilliance, but through numbers and endurance." Vogel nodded. "It is a machine for soldiers, not for engineers." In the brutal calculus of total war, the simplest machine often becomes the most powerful. The captured Jeep represented not just American ingenuity, but the industrial democracy of a nation that could turn factories into arsenals overnight. That day marked the beginning of a quiet study within German ranks. The Jeep was transported to a rear workshop. Reports were written and forwarded to Berlin. Intelligence officers attached photographs and descriptions to technical manuals. Engineers were asked to evaluate its design and practicality. Somewhere deep within the Reich's bureaucratic machinery, a new respect was born, grudging but real. The Jeep, a symbol of American wartime production, had crossed enemy lines and begun to change minds. It was no longer just an enemy vehicle. It was a messenger, whispering a truth that Germany's leadership was reluctant to hear, that the war was shifting, not because of tactics or valor, but because of industry, adaptability, and design philosophy. As the scene fades, the narrator concludes with a reflection. In a frozen field in 1943, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht learned an unexpected lesson from a small American car. They had captured not merely a machine, but a mirror, one that reflected the strength of a nation built on mass production and practical engineering. And though they did not yet know it, that mirror also showed the limits of their own empire. In the late winter of 1943, weeks after the Jeep's capture, it sat inside a makeshift German workshop built from the wreckage of a barn near Kharkov. Outside, snow drifted against the walls, muffling the sounds of distant gunfire. Inside, the air was filled with the smell of oil, grease, and damp canvas. Around a single lantern, a small group of Wehrmacht mechanics gathered. On a wooden workbench lay disassembled parts of the strange American machine, the Willys MB Jeep. Every component was labeled, sketched, and examined as though it were a relic of alien technology. What began as simple curiosity had evolved into fascination. Sergeant Wilhelm Vogel, the division's senior mechanic, adjusted his spectacles and held up a cylinder head. "It is crude," he said, "but effective. The casting is not perfect, yet it fits perfectly well enough." He tapped it with a wrench. You see, the Americans did not waste time polishing their engines to perfection. They made them to work and to keep working. Around him, the younger mechanics nodded, their curiosity overcoming their national pride. Private Kessler turned the carburetor in his hands, tracing its simple lines. "It is smaller than ours, and yet it does the same job," he murmured. Vogel smiled thinly. "Yes, and it can be replaced by any other of the same kind." That is the brilliance, standardization. At that moment, in a frozen barn on the Eastern Front, the German army discovered one of America's greatest wartime weapons, not a tank or a bomb, but a philosophy of production. Every bolt, nut, and gear of the Jeep told a story. The Germans were used to precision. Every vehicle they produced, from the Kübelwagen to the Panzer IV, was assembled with meticulous attention. But that precision came at a price. Each component required skilled craftsmen, specialized tools, and precious time. The American Jeep was the opposite. It was a symphony of simplicity, a machine that could be built by thousands of ordinary workers, maintained by soldiers in the field, and mass-produced on an unprecedented scale. Vogel gestured toward the gearbox. "You see this, Kessler? 3-speed transmission, no luxury, no waste." Built for function, he looked around at the other mechanics. "This is not a car built for comfort. It is a tool. It is made for war, not for the parade ground." The men nodded, their eyes fixed on the components before them. In their notebooks, they recorded measurements and sketches. They noted the use of interchangeable parts, identical bolts and fittings used in multiple places. Vogel compared this to the Kübelwagen, whose parts, though elegant, were rarely interchangeable between vehicles. The Germans had pursued perfection, while the Americans pursued practicality. In 1943, the German army was beginning to feel the limits of its own engineering genius. Complex machines demanded complex supply chains. A single missing component could disable an entire vehicle. The American Jeep, by contrast, could be repaired anywhere by anyone with basic tools and a little ingenuity. The mechanics' admiration grew with every discovery. They noticed the waterproofed ignition system, designed for river crossings and harsh climates. They marveled at the Jeep's leaf spring suspension that handled rough terrain without complaint. Even the fold-down windshield and detachable tools impressed them, a design that anticipated the unpredictable realities of war. Private Kessler, running his hand along the fender, said quietly, "It feels like it was built by someone who has fought in the mud." Vogel nodded. Exactly. The American soldier and the American worker share the same logic: practical, direct, and efficient. By midday, the men had reassembled the Jeep. Vogel climbed into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and the engine started immediately. The steady hum filled the barn. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Vogel smiled, rare and genuine. "Gentlemen, I think we have underestimated our enemy." The Wehrmacht mechanics' discovery was not simply technical, it was philosophical. It forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that the enemy they faced was not only fighting with bravery, but with a system designed for endurance. The Jeep was the perfect expression of that system, the marriage of simplicity and mass production. Fisher, the officer who had ordered the Jeep's recovery, arrived to inspect their progress. He circled the running vehicle, taking notes. So he asked, "What do you make of it?" Vogel replied carefully, "It is extraordinary, Herr Oberleutnant. Not because it is advanced, but because it is not. It can be repaired with almost anything, even by men with little training. It is not a machine for engineers, it is a machine for soldiers." Fisher frowned thoughtfully. "And how does it compare to our Kübelwagen?" Vogel hesitated. He was a proud German mechanic, loyal to his craft. Yet honesty compelled him. The Kübelwagen is a fine vehicle, light, efficient, well-designed. But it is delicate. The Jeep is different. It can endure punishment the Kübelwagen cannot. It is heavier, yes, but more forgiving. It was not made to impress, it was made to survive. The officer nodded slowly. "Then it seems we have something to learn." Something to learn, that phrase lingered among the men long after the officer left. They knew it would never reach the upper echelons of Berlin, where pride ruled over pragmatism. Yet among the mechanics, there was growing respect for the American approach to war. The Jeep embodied an industrial democracy, machines made not for prestige, but for purpose. Throughout the German army, captured Jeeps were studied, copied, and even used. Wehrmacht reports classified them under the term Butefahrzeuge, meaning captured vehicles. The Americans had built over 600,000 Jeeps by the end of the war. The Germans, despite their technical mastery, could never match such scale. To the soldiers who examined that little car in Kharkov, it became clear that this war was being fought as much in the factories as on the front lines. Vogel and his men continued their study for days. They drew diagrams comparing the Jeep's design to their own vehicles. They noted that its chassis, though less refined, was stronger under stress. They calculated that each Jeep could be produced in a fraction of the time it took to build a Kübelwagen. And they realized that the Americans had solved a problem the Germans could not: how to turn industry into a weapon of speed and quantity without losing effectiveness. Late one night, Vogel wrote in his notebook, "The Jeep is the enemy's philosophy in steel, rough, reliable, and built by many hands. We strive for perfection, they strive for plenty. Perhaps that is why they will endure." Historians would later confirm that the German army's evaluation of the Jeep was accurate. The American design reflected the nation's industrial might and its philosophy of standardization. Where Germany relied on craftsmanship, the United States relied on process. That difference would define the outcome of the war. Before dawn, Fisher returned for a final inspection. The Jeep's headlights illuminated the dark, casting long shadows on the barn walls. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "if we had built machines like this, perhaps the war would be different." Vogel did not answer. He only looked at the Jeep's engine, still warm from testing, and thought of the vast factories across the ocean that could produce thousands more. In that cold barn, German mechanics learned a lesson no textbook could teach. The Jeep was not only a vehicle, it was a revelation. It showed that the strength of a nation lay not in its perfection, but in its ability to equip every soldier, every front, and every road with the tools to endure. The simplicity they had once dismissed had become the ultimate sophistication. In the spring of 1943, as the snows melted into the black mud of the Eastern Front, the captured American Jeep sat inside a German logistics depot near Smolensk. It had been shipped there under special order from the Wehrmacht's Technical Evaluation Branch. Engineers, officers, and administrators gathered to inspect it, men whose task was not merely to fight a war, but to understand the machinery that made war possible. The Jeep, once an anonymous battlefield tool, had now become a subject of serious study. By 1943, Germany's war machine was still powerful, but it was no longer unmatched. The United States had entered the conflict 18 months earlier, and its industrial capacity had begun to reshape the global balance. For every tank or truck the Germans built, America produced dozens. The small captured Jeep before them was not simply a vehicle. It was a message from an industrial civilization that was redefining warfare itself. The engineers moved slowly around the machine, notebooks in hand. They compared measurements, noted tolerances, and took photographs. One of them, Oberengineer Otto Kross, was a veteran of the Volkswagen development team that had built the Kübelwagen. He ran his hands along the Jeep's rough edges and frowned. "It lacks elegance," he said. "But that is not a flaw, it is deliberate." Kross understood immediately what others were only beginning to grasp. The Americans had designed this vehicle for speed, not on the battlefield, but in the factory. It could be built quickly, maintained easily, and repaired under fire. The Germans, meanwhile, were still locked in a tradition of craftsmanship, where each part was meticulously shaped and hand-fitted. The Jeep represented something new: industrial warfare, where production lines and assembly speed were as decisive as artillery and armor. As Kross spoke, an intelligence officer handed him a report compiled from allied sources. It contained staggering figures. By that point, American factories had produced more than 200,000 Jeeps, with projections to double that by the following year. Ford Motor Company and Willys Overland were working around the clock, using mass production techniques perfected during the Great Depression. At the same time, Germany struggled to keep up. Its factories were scattered, its materials limited, its workforce depleted by the demands of total war. Cross exhaled slowly. "This is how they will defeat us," he said. "Not through better machines, but through more of them." World War II was not only a clash of armies, it was a contest of economies. The American system, born from assembly lines and driven by industrial democracy, could produce the ordinary at an extraordinary scale. The German system, though technically advanced, was bound by its own perfectionism. Every machine was a masterpiece, and masterpieces are slow to build. The Jeep was proof. The engineers studying it realized that its production design allowed thousands of unskilled workers to participate. Each part could be swapped with another from a different factory, anywhere in the United States. That level of standardization was unprecedented. German production, by contrast, was fragmented. Factories built specialized components, often incompatible between models. Even identical tanks might require different spare parts. The difference was not just technical, it was philosophical. Cross addressed his colleagues. "This vehicle is a lesson in priorities. We have built machines that need engineers. They have built machines that need soldiers. We are fighting a war that demands numbers, not perfection." This realization spread beyond the workshop. Across occupied Europe, German officers and industrial planners began to study the American war economy. Reports circulated about Ford's Willow Run plant, which produced one B-20 for bomber every hour. They read about the Kaiser shipyards, where Liberty ships were assembled faster than submarines could sink them. Each revelation struck at the same truth. The United States had turned production itself into a weapon. At a meeting in Berlin, technical officers compared notes. The Jeep appeared again in their discussions, not as a curiosity, but as a symbol. One officer declared, "It is the distilled essence of American war industry, practical, democratic, efficient." Another replied bitterly, "And yet we cannot copy it. Our system does not allow it." Germany's industrial model, rooted in hierarchy and specialization, could not adapt to the flexible, high-volume methods that powered American manufacturing. Even when the Reich introduced programs to standardize production, such as the Speer reforms, they never achieved the speed or efficiency of Allied industry. The Jeep stood as an unspoken indictment, proof that simplicity could outlast complexity. The contrast between the Jeep and the Kübelwagen became a metaphor studied by both sides. The Kübelwagen, with its air-cooled engine and lightweight design, was brilliant in concept, but limited by terrain and conditions. The Jeep, heavier and rougher, was unstoppable. It did not need paved roads or special maintenance. It belonged to no class or rank. Generals and privates alike could drive it. It was the people's machine, a product of a society that placed utility above prestige. As the months passed, German officers saw more Jeeps on the battlefield. Captured examples appeared in every theater of war, from North Africa to Italy, from the Ardennes to the Eastern Front. Some were repainted with Balkan Crews insignia and pressed into German service. They became silent witnesses to the transformation of modern warfare. At the same time, American production continued to accelerate. By 1944, more than 500,000 Jeeps had rolled off assembly lines. The vehicle became as common as the rifle, a symbol of mobility and adaptability. The United States had achieved something no other nation had managed. It had industrialized reliability. In one particularly revealing German report, dated September 1943, engineers described the Jeep as a technical expression of the American way of war, simple, direct, and efficient. They concluded that its success cannot be replicated without an equivalent industrial foundation. That admission was profound. It acknowledged that victory in modern war belonged not to the most advanced machines, but to the nations that could build, ship, and sustain them in vast numbers. Cross, writing his final evaluation, summarized it bluntly: "Our engineering seeks perfection. Theirs seeks production. The result is that they will always have more." Historians would later see this as the turning point of the Industrial War. Germany's engineers could design marvels, the Tiger tank, the Messerschmitt jet, the V-2 rocket, but such weapons demanded time, labor, and resources that Germany no longer possessed. America's simpler machines, produced by the millions, overwhelmed the battlefield through sheer presence. As 1943 turned to 1944, the implications of the Jeep's philosophy spread across Allied and Axis lines alike. In Washington, planners at the War Production Board cited the Jeep as a model for future military standardization. In Berlin, Albert Speer urged rationalization of production, but faced resistance from industrial cartels and political rivalries. The two nations stood at opposite poles of industrial logic, one built for efficiency, the other for excellence. The captured Jeep had revealed more than clever design. It exposed the soul of a nation at war. The American genius was not mechanical brilliance alone, but organizational strength, the ability to mobilize every worker, every factory, every assembly line toward a single goal. In that sense, the Jeep was not just a vehicle of war. It was a moving declaration of industrial democracy. As the German engineers filed their final report, one note stood out. It read, "If the Reich had 1,000 factories like those that built this machine, the outcome of this war would not be in doubt." The little Jeep sat quietly in the corner of the workshop, its olive paint dulled by dust, its tires flat. But to those who understood it, it had already spoken volumes, a symbol of how the power of simplicity and scale could shape the fate of nations. In May of 1945, the war in Europe was finally over. The guns that had thundered for 6 years fell silent, and the ruins of cities stretched from Normandy to Berlin. Amid the devastation, millions of machines, tanks, trucks, aircraft, and the small, indestructible Jeeps stood as the silent relics of the most mechanized conflict in human history. Yet among the soldiers, engineers, and historians who studied the aftermath, one truth became clear. The humble Jeep had left an imprint far deeper than anyone could have imagined. In the aftermath of victory, armies counted their losses, industries counted their costs, and engineers counted their lessons. For the German officers and mechanics who had once studied a captured Jeep in the snows of the Eastern Front, those lessons now seemed prophetic. The very simplicity that had seemed crude in 1943 had proved to be the secret weapon of the modern world. At Allied headquarters in Frankfurt, piles of captured German documents revealed a trove of technical reports. Among them were pages of handwritten notes, evaluations of the American Jeep by German engineers. They described its efficiency, its modular design, and its astonishing durability under extreme conditions. The reports confirmed that the Jeep had been more than just transportation. It had been a model for industrial efficiency and adaptability. The Jeep became the embodiment of a new kind of power, not the power of complexity, but of coordination. It represented a system in which factories, workers, and soldiers formed a single network of purpose. Every bolt, every gear, every wheel was part of an industrial language that spoke of cooperation and speed. In that sense, the Jeep was not merely an American invention, it was a symbol of democracy in motion. As post-war Europe began to rebuild, the influence of the Jeep spread far beyond the battlefield. The US Army left thousands of vehicles behind, and they were quickly adopted by civilian authorities, farmers, and explorers. In France, Italy, and Norway, the sight of a Jeep navigating broken roads became a symbol of liberation and reconstruction. In the Soviet Union, where many Jeeps had arrived through Lend-Lease, engineers quietly studied their design for adaptation into domestic models. Meanwhile, in Germany, the memory of the captured Jeep lingered among surviving engineers. Otto Kross, once the skeptical inspector in Smolensk, found work in the emerging West German auto industry. He later admitted in an interview that the Jeep had changed his understanding of engineering forever. "We learned that perfection is not always superior," he said. "A machine that everyone can build and everyone can repair, that is the true perfection." This new philosophy helped shape the post-war automotive world. Volkswagen, reborn from the remnants of the Reich's industry, eventually produced the Type 181 thing, a civilian descendant of both the Kubel wagon and, indirectly, the Jeep, across the Atlantic. The Willys Overland Company transformed its wartime design into the CJ series, the civilian Jeep, the same rugged simplicity that had carried soldiers through Europe and the Pacific now carried farmers, builders, and explorers through peacetime. The Jeep had done something extraordinary. It had transcended war. It had become a cultural icon, a mechanical metaphor for freedom, endurance, and ingenuity. What began as a response to military necessity became the seed of a global automotive movement. By the 1950s, the Jeep's DNA appeared in vehicles worldwide, from the British Land Rover to the Japanese Toyota Land Cruiser. Nations that had once fought each other now competed to create their own versions of the universal utility vehicle. The principles that German mechanics had admired in that Kharkov barn, simplicity, standardization, and durability, became the foundation of post-war engineering. In many ways, the Jeep story mirrored the larger story of the 20th century. It showed how industrial democracy could outlast industrial dictatorship. The same factories that once produced bombers and tanks turned to making cars, tractors, and tools for peace. The same assembly lines that had built machines of war now built machines for everyday life. The Jeep was the bridge between those worlds. Yet historians also recognize the Jeep's symbolic power within the context of wartime philosophy. It was proof that innovation need not always mean complexity. In the hands of American engineers, innovation had meant removing unnecessary parts, reducing failure points, and trusting in standardization. That trust in the power of the collective rather than the individual craftsman was what made the Jeep unstoppable. Back in the archives of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, engineers who had overseen wartime production reflected on the same lesson. One memo from 1946 read, "The enemy sought perfection, we sought production. Our machines may not have been beautiful, but they were everywhere, and that made all the difference." In war, perfection is the enemy of speed. The Americans had learned that lesson early, and their vehicles embodied it. The German engineers who studied the Jeep saw a reflection of something deeper, a national temperament that valued practicality over pride, results over refinement. As the 1950s progressed, the Jeep's reputation only grew. It appeared in films, newsreels, and advertisements as the ultimate symbol of freedom and resilience. Its square body and 7-slot grille became instantly recognizable around the world. Soldiers, adventurers, and ordinary citizens alike saw it as a machine that could go anywhere, do anything, and never give up. The war had ended, but the Jeep's mission continued, not as a weapon, but as a teacher. It taught that design is not only an art, but a strategy. That simplicity can achieve what sophistication cannot, and that the strength of a nation lies in its ability to make the extraordinary accessible to the ordinary. In museums today, from the Imperial War Museum in London to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, visitors can still see the Willys MB Jeep on display. Its small frame sits quietly among larger and more famous machines, tanks, aircraft, artillery. Yet historians often remind audiences that none of those machines could have won the war alone. The Jeep, simple and unassuming, carried messages, wounded soldiers, officers, and supplies across impossible terrain. It was the connective tissue of the Allied armies. For the Germans who once stood in that barn on the Eastern Front, the Jeep had been an object of curiosity. For the world that came after, it became a lesson in how simplicity can shape destiny. It showed that genius is not always found in the complexity of design, but in the wisdom of restraint. In one of his final reports, Oberleutnant Karl Fischer wrote a quiet observation. Years later, in a private letter, "We were engineers of precision, and we built wonders. But the Americans built tools that everyone could use. In that, perhaps, lies the future." Indeed, that future had already arrived. The Jeep's spirit lived on in every modern vehicle built for purpose and endurance. It inspired not just engineers, but entire industries. It reminded nations that the measure of progress is not how complex a machine can be, but but how well it serves those who depend upon it. And in that enduring truth, born on the frozen roads of the Eastern Front, the captured Jeep still drives on, carrying with it the lessons of a world transformed by simplicity.